ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. I am your host, Chris George Zuger, and you have entered the Den of Lore. Pull your chair up to the fire, grab yourself a cup of joe because it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to be learning some cool shit courtesy of one of the greatest historians alive today, and one of the most controversial. Mr. David Rohl is joining us live in the den, although not actually in the den, because he is currently online with me from the wilds of much warmer than where we are in Ottawa, Spain. And I'm quite excited to have him on the show with me and for all of you today. We're going to be discussing the topics of pharaohs and kings, Egypt, new chronology, as well as his recent travels through Jordan and Israel, filming the new Patterns of Evidence Moses special. Oh my goodness, I cannot wait for this. Oh, I've been waiting for this show for so long. Oh man. Let me welcome everyone here now. To let everyone know, you know, I do dress up sometimes. I do clean up quite well, and you know, I have to make sure that we look the part where possible. Now, I want to be able to give a special thank you to our patrons who ensure that we can continue to operate, continue to bring you the greatest minds in alternative research and alternative ideas, as well as mainstream academia today. And if we're not for our patrons, well, it would be kind of hard to keep the lights on. So I want to give a very special thank you to our illustrious masters, Jackie from across the pond and Pat from Brooklyn, as well as to our masters who have been with us since the beginning: Jenny, Dormamere, Rainoff, Lee Veltman, Chuck Schwartz, Jared Thompson, Mrs. Fox, Roses, Joshua E. Maddock, Mark Catalano, and our den mother, Ellen McCurdy. As well as thank you to our other patrons, Andre Rowan, Mike Rice, Eclipse, Eric J. Ferguson, Martin Hackinson, Photopic, Nick Zed, Gray Yurt, Charles Davis, Thiago Bauer, Michael Eckhoff, Dean John Kedward, Anthony Derry, Atlanta, Kush, Venice from Magical Egypt, Christopher Moody, Robin Webley, and courtesy of denoflore.com's PayPal button, Hobby. You can go to denoflore.com patreon.com/denoflore. Support us for as little as $1 and ensure that this independent media channel stays on the air for the foreseeable future. Now, before we get to our special guest for today, I want to be able to give just a quick heads up for all of you who are on the eastern seaboard for this weekend. Tomorrow, as we all do know, a very, very good friend of the show, Laird, Scranton, and Ed Nightingale have a symposium at Vassar College, the day of instruction on ancient cosmology, and that is going to be in Kingston, New York, as well as it is running from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. You can email Laird at scrantonlr@aol.com. Tickets are $25 per attendee to cover room costs, and you can also just Google that on, or Google, search for it on Facebook. I will ensure that the link is shared on Den of Lore's Facebook page. So again, if you want to be able to make sure you can keep up to date with all the news, go check out facebook.com/Den of Lore, twitter.com/Den of Lore. Pretty well just any social media account, if you put /Den of Lore, you'll be able to find us. And speaking of finding us, David, I'm finding you quite the amazing individual this morning. You are here.
And I'm here. I am. Morning, Chris.
Good morning. How
it's
are you?
Afternoon here, actually. Just tea time coming up.
I just rolled out of bed myself and grabbed a good cup.
It's a wonder about internet, isn't it? That you can be fast asleep in a bed somewhere listening to your show, or waking up in the morning for breakfast, or having afternoon tea like me. It's the amazing thing about the internet.
It is. The only downside is whenever we do a show, I have to think in 6 time zones. It's like trying to wrap your mind around a tesseract. It's very difficult to do, but still manageable. But it allows us to be able to share ideas and to sit down and, well, at least I hope you're sitting down. I hope you're comfortable.
I'm actually reclining, if that's all right with you. Yeah, I'm feeling very comfortable here.
Let me join you on that one. There we go. Okay. So, David, it's been actually, I think it's been about a year since you were on the show last.
I think that's right, yeah.
And during that time, I know that we've both had a lot of things happen. You went on a extensive trip and film expedition to the Levant to film the new Patterns of Evidence special, which for anybody who follows your social media, whether Facebook or on Twitter, the photos looked very, very alluring and gave a very good taste. And I know
it was an amazing trip, actually, with Tim Mahoney, the director, yes. And we did cover an awful lot of ground. And as you say, the scenery is just stunning out there. Absolutely amazing.
And also, about the same time that I was embracing the changes of life that fatherhood could bring, I know that you went through some struggles yourself.
Yeah, health problems, yeah. Well, I was in hospital for 21 days over Christmas and New Year, so I didn't have much of a celebration over the festive season. All to do with intestinal troubles, something that I've had for many, many years. I mean, I've been out in the Middle East since I was 9 years old, and over the years I've managed to get myself, quite ill with wrong sorts of water and things like that. So I had to go in and have some work done, as it were, on the plumbing side.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it was, if I mispronounce this. See, if I mispronounce something on this show, the running joke the last several months has been everyone takes a shot. So if I mispronounce this, everyone take a swig of your coffee. Diverticulitis, which...
diverticulosis, yes.
Which is the same, it's the same illness that Brock Lesnar, who is the former UFC heavyweight champion, also suffered from. He was actually won the championship while he was battling it. And I know that you're a much more tough individual than he is, so it's glad to see you back, and it's glad to see you back lecturing. For an individual as warm and welcoming as you, it's good to know that you can lick something like that.
Well, yeah, hopefully. I'm still going through the process. I mean, it takes a long time to get it all sorted out, and I've got an operation to go through in a few months when it's booked. So, yeah, I'll get through it. It's not a problem. It's all part and parcel of the trade that I'm in. Archaeology in the Middle East, you always get ill. I mean, so many great archaeologists succumb to various problems of health as a result of working in the Middle East. It's a difficult area to work in most of your life.
And it's the same with any other part of the world. Each place has its own obstacles or things that can just come out and get you. In Australia, it's spiders, some that are the size of your head.
That's quite right. And they usually come out of the toilet, don't they, in Ausland?
Oh, when I was in Melbourne, I actually found one in my bed. And I actually slept on my sister's couch for a couple of days after that, just because it freaked me out too much.
I'm not surprised.
I would still take a spider because you can take care of it over what we have to deal with here in Canada, which over the last 6 months has been hockey players, polar bears, and moose. We just had a nice storm this week, and it's the end of April. It shouldn't be -10.
No, exactly.
Although going in the opposite direction and going in a much more positive temperature. The last time you were here, we covered pretty well the entire new chronology and had discussed the past Patterns of Evidence series as well as the timeline. But I first wanted to start this time with, I think where we left off, which was Zep Tepi.
Ah, right.
And this is a subject matter that Denver Michaels, who's a friend and co-author of a book that we're coming out with, as well as co-host for Crypto Corner, we're starting our researches with Atlantis. That's kind of the joke of the show. And the idea of Zep Tepi being a primordial retelling of creation based on the various different cults, depending on the city for which god that city worships, and each one being a retelling from their point of view, as it were. What do you know of the mythos, or what was your learning on it from your research?
Well, I mean, I can only do it from an Egyptological perspective. In ancient Egypt, there was a mythology of creation, Zep Tepi, first time, as it means, but not the one that you would normally hear, I don't think. The original story is actually inscribed on the walls of Edfu Temple in Upper Egypt or the south. But although that's a Greco-Roman temple, quite late in its construction, it has these stories and these legends that go way, way back to the first time. And it's carved up on the pronaos area of the temple, which is very high up. You can't actually physically see it unless you climb up on the exterior wall of the temple and then you're in front of it. But if you're just wandering around the bottom near the temple itself, you don't actually see the inscription at all. So it's not intended to be viewed by the general public, and never was. But up there is a relief, a scene of 8 gods. And they are sitting on thrones on a primeval mound, a sandy island, which is surrounded by reed swamps. So you have a bunch of reeds there, and on top of the reeds is Horus, the falcon god. He's actually perched on the reeds. And behind them we have these 8 gods. And then in front of the Horus falcon, you have the king worshipping Horus and the 8 gods of the primeval mound. Now that is the story of Sept creation in the Egyptian terms, but the gods' names are totally different to what we would normally expect. None of them you would recognize as Egyptian gods. I can give you the first 3, for example. The first one is called Aa, which means Wa'a, which is the distant one. And now Aa, the second god, means the great one, and the third god, strangely enough, is Nai. And Nai is the word for sailor. So there's a connection with these gods to something overseas in terms of Egypt. So you're looking at gods who came from afar over the seas. Usually Wa'a, the distant one, is an epithet that we normally associate with the 3 flood heroes of Sumer, ancient Sumeria and Babylon and Acadia. So you have these names, they have this epithet, the distant one. So there seems to be an association there. And the word Horus itself, or Ha, also means the distant one, the one from afar. The second god, Aa, the great god, or it could be Thoth, it could be, who's thrice great, as you know, the old ideas of Hermes being thrice great. And so you have these 2 connections, and you have this sailor character. Now, the sailor is probably a navigator more than a sailor, we imagine. So he would be associated with a later god called Wep-Wawet, who's the opener of the ways. So they are probably early names for these gods we know of. Horus, Thoth, and then, of course, you've got Wep-Wawet. So this is a very, very early version of the story of creation. And we're talking about them coming from a place called the Isle of Flame. Now, the Isle of Flame is when you stand at dawn and you look towards the east, you see the sun rising and the glow on the horizon. That's what the Egyptians termed the Isle of Flame, or Light Land was another expression they used. So we're clearly associated with something from the east, which is where the Egyptians conceived resurrection. So you die and you're buried in the west, which is the land of the dead. You'll then travel through the underworld and you rise on the eastern horizon, reborn, as it were, resurrected, for your journey across the sky in the daytime, just like the sun dies in the west and rises in the east. So the concept that the Egyptians had was of a primeval mound of creation in Lightland in the east, towards the east from an Egyptian perspective. Okay, so you look from the east, from west, which is Egypt, towards the east, and that's where you find Lightland.
And for East, I know that there are some researchers who are speculating that this either could have been some land, whether we're dealing with a currently submerged land or in and around the Indonesian area, or it could have been literally a land between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which during the last ice age was above water. I think you can go a lot more simple than that. There was an island which, according to Sumerian mythology and legend and the Sumerian king's list, was the first place on earth where kingship came down from heaven, descended from heaven. And that's the place where the first temple was built in the world as well, according to Sumerian mythology. And that location is a place called Eridu, which is in the southern part of Iraq, in the marshland area, just to the north of the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. And that was the primeval city on earth as far as the Sumerians and Mesopotamians were concerned. Now, it was called Nun-Ki. That was the Sumerian term for this place, Eridu. Nun-Ki means the mighty place. Now, Nun is a word that appears also in the Egyptian mythology for creation too, because the primeval mound is surrounded by the waters of Nun.
in the Egyptian text. So there is an association between Nun of Egypt, the primeval abyss, as it were, the waters of chaos, and Nun, which was actually in Eridu, which was also a freshwater abyss or primeval swamp, which surrounded a circular island upon which the first temple in the world was built. The first ziggurat was built there. So there may be a direct association between Mesopotamia and Egypt rather than looking further afield.
I know that one of your first specials dealt specifically with finding the Garden of Eden, or at least the traditional area for the Garden of Eden within the old Sumerian lands. If we're dealing with that part of the world, the Levant as well as the Persian Peninsula, have you run into any obstacles or opposition from either government or political groups, I should say, with trying to link those areas together historically?
No, not at all. The opposite, in fact, happened. When I was going out to Iran, ancient Persia, and I was traveling up through the Zagros Mountains on several expeditions through Kurdistan and Luristan and all those areas, and going up to the area which I believe is the location of Eden, Edin in the Sumerian, which means uncultivated land area, like a plain, as it were. And we were doing a lot of work in that area, and all the toponyms seemed to fit very well with the original story in the second chapter of Genesis. It got published, obviously, in the book Legend, The Genesis of Civilization, and I got contacted by an American who was an entrepreneur, and he said he wanted to bottle the water from Eden, my location that I'd found, because there's a sacred spring there on the mountain called the Mountain of the Chalice, which was a volcano, where a water flowed down into the Ajichai Valley, which is what I believe to be the Garden of Eden location. And he said he wanted to bottle this water and call it Eden water. So he sought approval from the government in Iran, and he got approval from the Ayatollah, who's the head of the government, the religious leader of Iran today, to say that he approved the idea because he agreed with the location of Eden being in what we call today Western Azerbaijan. So that's the westernmost part, northwesternmost part of Iran today, and near the city of Tabriz. So we actually got approval from the Iranian government for this American to go ahead and bottle this water and sell it all around the world. In the end, he didn't actually do it, but the approval was there from the government.
Which is very interesting, because I know that, at least in media, and if you're on social media today, there seems to be a lot of division when it comes to something as simple and basic as faith. And I understand faith can be a very personal thing, and it can be very different than religion, which is more of an organized belief in something. But still, this would be more of an example of what it's supposed to be, which is something that's a unifying and positive force. That this idea of history and that faith being combined can, bridge the gap between two cultures which have been at odds politically for a very long time.
Yeah, basically, the foundation of faith has to be history, because faith is based on books like the Bible or the Quran or whatever, which tell stories about the past, and without those books there would be no religion, no faith. Basically, I mean, it's like. If it's fantasy, if it's legend, well, no, legend is probably based on reality, but if it's mythology or fantasy, then you're basically, the people who use those books for their worship, for their faith, for their belief systems, would be effectively reading a Harry Potter novel and worshipping that. But, because we have to find the evidence that's in those books to confirm them, to ratify them, as it were, which I think is a legitimate exercise to do, then if you can actually demonstrate that there is historical veracity within those stories, and it's got a framework of history, then it supports and reinforces those people who have faith. It's not blind faith we're dealing with here, it's actually intelligent faith, which we should be looking at. In other words, you have to have a basis, a foundation of history in order to have a belief system.
And what about in Egypt specifically? Has this have you run into the same positive attitude, or has there been any issues linking let's say the Exodus or any of the post Exodus or sojourn period after the Exodus?
It's a little bit different in Egypt because the politics is quite different there. As you probably know, and I'm sure your listeners will be well aware, there's been a sort of king of the media and archaeology in Egypt for many, many years, called Zahi Hawass, who's no longer in power, thank goodness. And he controlled access to the media in Egypt, access to the site. So if you wanted to film a documentary or film a particular site, you had to go through him to get permission. And so he always insisted that if the show was going to be filmed in Egypt, then he would be in the show. He had to be in the show. So his face would appear in virtually every single National Geographic or Discovery Channel or History Channel documentary. He became very famous, very well known. And he, of course, he toured in America and lectured to huge audiences. But he had control of the whole thing. And so if you didn't agree, or if he didn't agree with the storyline that you were submitting for your film documentary, then he would forbid you to be filming there. And so anything to do with what he would call the Jews, he would ban in Egypt. You were not allowed to film anything to do with the Israelites or the Exodus or Moses or anything like that. You had to go to Morocco to film those programs, and that's what the BBC did. In fact, I went with the BBC to Morocco to film a documentary on Moses. So you end up in a situation where Egypt will refute or deny access to anybody who wants to film any of the stories related to the Book of Genesis or the books of Exodus. So it was impossible until Zahi disappeared, as it were, or went away. Now that things have changed a little, it's interesting. I've never actually been to Egypt to put forward a documentary on the stories of the Bible since Zahi's gone. But I would imagine it would be much easier now than it was in the past when we had real troubles.
Now, speaking of differences of storyline, for instance, we'll say, I've been listening to a lot of lectures regarding ancient Egyptian history, as well as the dynastic kings and that overall line, as well as contrasting it with several of your lectures, as well as your lecture series, your 2 DVD set, which is available on the Patterns of Evidence website, as well as on Amazon. The link for that is in the show notes, ladies and gentlemen. It's only $20. Amazing deal. Go check it out. Your mind will be blown. And it's very jarring to hear, and I'm going to say jarring because even as an individual who's been studying, as a layperson, biblical history since my early days in Sunday school when I was a 5-year-old, hearing the very compelling evidence you give for the mistranslation of Ramses and placing the history starting in the 13th dynasty, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And then hearing an individual come forward and say, no, this was actually during the 19th dynasty. And they can still produce a lot of evidence. It's just they have not been able to produce the same compelling evidence as you've been able to. The most amazing being the discovery of Joshua's residence, as it were, and tomb.
Joseph's residence. Joseph, yes. Well, the trouble is that if you go along the Ramesses Exodus theory line, in other words, that the Exodus took place in around 1250 BC, the time of Ramesses II, and you look for the evidence in Egypt of a large population of Semites, people speaking a Semitic language, in that area, you don't find it. You don't find any evidence at all. And when you go across to Israel and you look for evidence of a destroyed Jericho or a conquest of the Promised Land, you find, again, no evidence for it. So it means that you have a whole group of archaeologists and historians now who say that these stories never happened. They didn't exist. There was no exodus out of Egypt. There was no large population of Semites living in Egypt at that time. There was no conquest of the Promised Land. So the whole thing is a fable. That's basically the standard secular argument now for the Ramesses Exodus theory. What I did was I said, well, hang on a minute. Let's look for a time when Jericho was destroyed. We do have the site of Jericho. We know where it was. And the big city of Jericho was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, Ramesses is a late Bronze Age king, pharaoh. So it's when Ramesses was around, there was no Jericho. Jericho was just an abandoned ruin. So I went back to the date when the city was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and I looked then back towards Egypt, and I found a huge population of Semites, or what we call Western Asiatics, living in the eastern delta of Egypt, where the Bible calls the land of Goshen. And that's the area where we have the tomb of Joseph, we have the palace of Joseph, we have a residence for Jacob, his father, we have a small village of Semites suddenly appearing at the end of the 12th dynasty and growing to this huge city of around 30,000 people. And then they suddenly all disappear. I mean, the Asiatic quarter just empties. and there's no trace of them. The city is sort of abandoned for a period of time in that particular area, and then a new group of people come in and reoccupy it again. Well, it seemed to me to be very much like the story of the Exodus. So then I looked at the evidence in the Promised Land in Israel, and then we did find, as I say, that Jericho was destroyed at that time. Hatzor was occupied at that time and destroyed. We find the city of Shiloh, the place where the ark was kept, was suddenly inaugurated at that time. So everything seemed to fit perfectly, and so then I focused on that particular era, what we call the Middle Bronze 2B, as the period of the Exodus and the conquest of the Promised Land, and everything seemed to fit. But then, of course, your academics would say, well, it's impossible, because we know that Ramesses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, because in the first chapter of the book of Exodus, it says that the Israelites built a city called Ramses, and therefore, if they built a city called Ramses, there had to be a pharaoh called Ramesses, because the name is the same. The only problem with that is that if you look back into the book of Genesis, you find that Joseph settled his father, Jacob, in the land of Ramesses, which later became the land of Goshen in the story. Now, but there was never a Ramesses at the time of Joseph and Jacob. They didn't come along until the 19th dynasty. So it's what we call an anachronism. It's not possible for a land of Ramesses to exist at the time of Joseph. So equally, if that's not possible, why should we accept the Ramesses of the time of Moses? Again, that could be anachronistic. It could be a later writer of the Bible or somebody who's editing the Bible renaming the place according to what it was known in his day, the name it was known in his day, rather than the ancient name for the place, which is the city underneath Ramesses, a city called Avaris, and that seems to be the city of the Asiatics, the Western Asiatics, because that's where we find this huge population of Semites, which suddenly disappear and go off to somewhere in the desert, disappear from it.
Now, there has been rumors, and I'm hearing this in our YouTube chat, of there being discovery of chariots in the Red Sea. Is there any credence to this?
Oh, that's a huge story. No is the answer. That's the short version. What we've got is a guy called Ron Wyatt, who was a sort of explorer, Christian explorer, who claimed to have found all sorts of stuff. He claimed to have found Noah's Ark. He claimed to have found the city of Sodom, which was destroyed, as you know, by this catastrophe at the time of Abraham. He claims to have found the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. He claims to have met Jesus on a couple of occasions, who came to chat to him, and a lot of people follow him. A lot of people have followed him on this. One of his main claims was that the crossing point of this, what the Bible calls the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, was in fact the Gulf of Aqaba in the Red Sea, starting on a place called Nuweiba in Sinai and crossing over to Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. And he claimed that there was a saddle there, a subwater saddle between two great chasms, because it's the Rift Valley there, so it's very, very deep on both sides. And he says there's this saddle, underwater saddle, which when the waters parted, the Israelites must have crossed on. And then he got some divers, including himself, to go under the water, and he claims to have found evidence of chariots in the water at that point. Well, none of this is true, I have to say. The evidence for the chariots does not exist. You have a lot of coral in that area, which is strange type of coral. It's called table coral, which looks like sort of the chariot wheels and axles and things like that. And nobody's brought any evidence out from the sea to actually have a physical artifact we can examine at any point. And the depth of the water on that so-called saddle is 2,500 feet. Now, that's according to all the different surveys that have been done by the British Admiralty, the Israelis, and the Americans. Now, 2,500 feet is the same sort of height as the, what's it called now? The Burj Al Khalifa in Dubai, which is the tallest building in the world, which is twice the height of the Empire State Building. So try to imagine waters parting, which are 2,500 feet or twice the height of the Empire State Building. How realistic is that? We're not talking about, the sort of epic you see in the Cecil B. DeMille's movie. We're talking about something 50 times higher than that. It's a ridiculous concept. And he's sold this whole idea, and many people follow him on the basis that there's a shallow, as I say, underwater saddle there that you could actually cross through, which maybe would have been 20 or 30 feet below the surface of the water. Well, it's not. It's 2,500 feet below the surface of the water. So there's a lot of BS going on with this particular theory.
Oh my goodness. I'm not even going to get onto the whole Nibiru thing, which...
No, don't.
Oh my But I've even within our last episode, which and again, if you ever do speak to Baval, you'll have to let him know that you have overtaken him finally. Your show is our top show of all time.
Oh. He won't like that very much, I'll tell you that now.
Well, he'll just have to be able to come on and beat your record, I guess.
Sure.
But yours is also one of the most interactive, where we'll have people of all different faiths and ideas who will come in and give their ideas on the history. And one of the most prevalent theories that I've been getting in the YouTube comments is, what was it? That the angle of the slope of the Great Pyramid is the same angle from Cairo to Jerusalem, and it's not. It's off by several degrees. It's not the same distance. But these mythologies get said, they get adopted, and they get propagated with very little evidence. And it's good to be able to believe in the possibility of fantastic things if you can actually then back it up with credible research and facts that can say, no, this is a possibility beyond just stating a fact. Well, the trouble is facts become on the internet. That's the problem. It is, and I've gone from derision to just saying, okay, well, I'm sorry, you get no points for that one. 100 points for Gryffindor, though, and carrying on, because you can't. It's very difficult to be able to get somebody to believe in. If somebody believes in something, and even if you provide facts to be able to back up the opposite point, it generally tends to, what's the best term? Entrench them further into that belief, even if it is incorrect, because of something they may have seen on the internet. For the longest time. Well, at least for the longest time. When I was a kid, it's like I believed in Santa Claus, and then at some point I stopped believing, based on evidence and.
Shame on you. So what's wrong? What's wrong with Santa Claus then? He existed. He was a bishop of Myra in southern Turkey.
Yes, and he was very good, but
Saint Nicholas, and he used to give coins to the children each year. So I mean, he's a basis. He's got a basis in history.
This is true. Croatians actually celebrate St. Nicholas Day.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to remember if it's the 12th. We put our shoes out, and if we've been good, we get candy and those gold coin chocolates, which are fantastic.
Exactly.
And if we've been bad, we get coal. You always hope for the coal, because if it's a cold winter, you can heat yourself. But the chocolate's just as good.
I think we've got to distinguish between legends and myths. Basically, I mean, characters like Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, are legends. They are real people that have had a story woven around them. So those are based on real events, real historical events. Mythology is much more the invention of the creative mind. So, the things like the gods of Olympus, for instance, for argument's sake, or whatever it might be. So they're created out of a fertile mind, and they are fantasy. But legends are not fantasy; they're just elaborations upon history. That's what they really are.
And with regards to the pharaohs of Egypt, and a lot of the mythology from the early to Old Kingdom, the idea of the first dynasty, or the first king, I believe his name was. Well, I'm showing here there was Namer or Atha.
Nama, you're thinking of. Nama is an old idea as the first king of the first dynasty. The classical name for him is Menes, Menes, or Meni in Egyptian. That's the name that appears on the Abydos Kings list, where you get the first king of the first dynasty called Meni. But we now, a lot of Egyptologists now think that Meni is Horus Aha, or Horus the Fighter, who was actually the son of Nama. And it's much more likely that he is actually the first king of the first dynasty. But there's a dynasty before Dynasty 1 called Dynasty 0, which has now become part of the Egyptological literature. And there are kings in that dynasty, which includes Nama, who was probably the last king of Dynasty 0. You can go back to a king called Horus. So you actually have a Horus king, the original Horus king at the beginning of that sequence. And he seems to have had some relationship to the idea of this idea of Horus being the first king, maybe Osiris, and this sort of like era of the beginnings of kingship in Egypt goes back to what we call Nakada III, or the Nakada III period, which is just before the first dynasty begins. So about 80 to 100 years before the first dynasty. That is the area to look at for the beginnings of pharaonic civilization in Egypt, rather than the first dynasty. The first dynasty is much more about the establishment of control of the whole land at that period. But there are pharaonic kings, Horus kings, before that for about 100 years.
And for a lot of the dates for some of their, I'm going to say their the lengths of their lives, isn't the King's List in Egypt very similar in terms of its theme with regards to very long life as it is in Sumer?
In the Turin Canon and in Manetho, yes, you have these extraordinary ages for the demigods and the gods, but rather than the kings so much. But in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list, we have very, very great ages for the early kings of Mesopotamia, the pre-flood kings, similar to what you have in the Book of Genesis for the early patriarchs as well. So that's a hard one to explain, really. I mean, probably the most likely explanation is we're talking about what we call eponymous ancestors. In other words, the founder of a dynasty. So the dynasty would be named after an individual who may reign for 300 years, but in fact it's not him that's reigning for 300 years, it's his dynasty that reigns for 300 years. And the dynasty is named after him because he's the first of the dynasty. So that's one explanation for these longevities. And it might be the same in the Book of Genesis. It may well be that these early patriarchs, these figures like Methuselah and others, are simply the founders of dynasties, the eponymous ancestors of dynasties, and therefore they're not actually living for 900 years.
And how many... Actually, this is a very good question. I know that I have the answer in front of me, but a lot of people out there may wonder, how many dynasties are there, at least accepted, whether in... your realm of Egyptology to even the accepted realm of Egyptology?
Well, officially there's about 31, but if you include Dynasty 0, that makes 32, and that takes us to the period when the Roman Empire took over with Julius Caesar coming to Egypt, and that becomes then Egypt becomes a province of Rome. So we don't officially have a dynasty for the Roman emperors in Egypt, but the Ptolemies, the Greek pharaohs who came from northern Greece, Macedonia, that's an official dynasty. That's the dynasty of Egypt, and Cleopatra was the last pharaoh, if you like, of those dynasties when the dynasties came to an end. So you could say that the first king of the Dynasty 0 all the way down to Cleopatra is the total dynastic period in Egyptian history.
Now, for the I'm going to say the way that the power was either shared or was disseminated between the ruling houses, was the ruling class patriarchal or matriarchal in nature?
In Egypt, it was patriarchal, although we do have probably 4 or 5 female pharaohs throughout the time. But they're basically when there is no son to succeed the throne, so a daughter becomes pharaoh, and usually that causes the collapse of a dynasty. That's what usually happened. It happened at the end of the 12th dynasty. We have Queen Hatshepsut, of course, who's very famous, who usurped the throne, we think, from the rightful heir, which was a young boy called Thutmose III. And then he took over again, and Hatshepsut disappeared. And then we have, of course, Cleopatra further on, and we have Tausert at the end of the 19th dynasty. So there's a tendency for dynasties to come to an end with a female pharaoh. So it wasn't a good thing to be a female pharaoh, to be honest. But then women were respected greatly in Egypt. It's just they didn't hold the chains of power, as it were, most of the time. But I would say it was a patriarchal system that they had, and I think you could say that for pretty much most of the ancient world.
And I know that also with Egypt, especially in 2 periods of time, one which is related to the Patterns of Evidence series, one is before that, there are 2 intermediate periods between the Old and Middle and the Middle and New Kingdoms. Why? Well, first of all, their intermediate period, what's the reason for naming them these, and exactly what happened during this time?
Well, you have kingdoms, which is old, middle, and new. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. They're eras when the entire land of Egypt, remember it's a linear land, it goes from north to south, or from the south to north if you think of the flow of the river. It's just a strip of land, fertile either side of the river, and you've got desert on either side of that. So the deserts weren't part of Egypt. Egypt was called Kemi or Kemet, which means the black land, and most Egyptologists regard that as being the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley and the Delta. So the land of Egypt is very thin and narrow until it spread out at the Delta. So it has a linear politic, basically. So in the kingdom periods, the whole entire valley was united under one pharaoh, one king ruling the entire place. In the intermediate periods, they're in between the kingdom periods, you have periods where the land divides up into smaller kingdoms with their own pharaohs or their own rulers. So you'd have a ruler in the north, in the delta, or maybe two rulers up there. You'd have one in Middle Egypt, you'd have one in the south, you would have one down in Nubia or whatever. So you would have the kingdom divided up into smaller areas, and they would fight each other for dominance, and eventually there'd be a unification again. So you would usurp your neighbor, you would conquer his land, and you reunify the land again to become another kingdom period. So that's what the three intermediate periods are. So you have one between the old and the middle, you have one between the middle and the new, and you have one at the end of the new kingdom before what we call the late period or Saite period.
If I'm not mistaken, the first intermediate period lasted approximately how long?
Not long. It's one of the shorter ones. At the end of the Old Kingdom, we don't normally think of that as the sort of time of Pepi II, who was a remarkable pharaoh who reigned for 94 years. And he didn't seem to have a successor, and it sort of the dynasty petered out, and then it broke up. The land broke up into different segments, and we have kings of Hierakonpolis and kings of Memphis, etc., etc. And then it's reunified again in the beginning of the Middle Kingdom by Mentuhotep, who's one of the pharaohs who conquers the rest of the land. He's actually based in Thebes, and he conquers the entire land again. And so then you have the 12th dynasty, which is a very wonderful dynasty, and the 13th dynasty, and then you have the collapse of Egyptian civilization again, when the Hyksos come in from the east, from the Levant. They come across the Sinai and they conquer Egypt for about a period of 100 and something years. We're not sure if it's 180 or 140 years. And then we have the New Kingdom, which is a very powerful militaristic kingdom, very rich, very wealthy, very strong pharaohs. And then at the end of that, at the end of the 20th dynasty, we have another collapse, and the land divides up into many different units, as it were, pharaonic units in different parts of Egypt. And then it's reunified again at the beginning of the 26th dynasty. So this is a cycle that would continue all the way through Egyptian history. You have unification periods, and you have these intermediate periods in between.
And for these intermediate periods, were these times of great upheaval? You said it was the fall of civilization. Do we have an idea of what that would have been like?
Well, it's not so much that civilization collapses, more to the fact that there's no unification, no unified state. So you do have international wars between these. Quite often, some of them are actually relatives of each other. So they're fighting between each other. You've got smaller kingdom. What I suppose it's like is, I suppose it's like the United States all being separate states and fighting each other rather than being unified under one president. So it's the same sort of thing that was happening then. It doesn't mean you have a complete collapse of civilization, but it becomes somehow much more difficult to get wealth and trade because you're in dispute with your neighbor constantly.
And obviously that's never a good thing, especially for, let's say, being able to feed your people, or
exactly.
Large state projects like building pyramids or massive temples.
It's almost like this idea of trade wars that we have today, that, a unified world where you have trade between different nations is much better than having this sort of policy of aggression towards your neighbor and not allowing the produce of the neighbor to come into the country. That would have been the type of thing that was going on in Egypt at the time.
And for the Middle Kingdom,
yeah.
What was this period of time, what was it known as or known for?
It's known for the humanness of the kings, I think. The Old Kingdom is all about huge monuments, massive pyramids, etc., big egos. And then the Middle Kingdom is much more about the humanity of the pharaohs. And it's famous for its poetry and literature and its art. So the carvings and reliefs are beautiful. The poetry is lovely. The writings are wonderful. We have great stories from the Middle Kingdom that are used by students who learn to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. They use Middle Kingdom text to do that, and the statues of the pharaohs are not huge, monoliths, and you get individualism going on in this period. So it's regarded by many Egyptologists as the sort of like the culmination of civilization in Egyptian terms. Then, of course, we get the New Kingdom, which is more about power and wealth and military conquest. That's a different type of period entirely. So I'm quite drawn to the Middle Kingdom for that reason, because I think it's a very human era in Egyptian history.
And the Middle Kingdom obviously starts with the 11th dynasty, with, I'm going to butcher this probably, Irpat the Elder, or Intef the Elder, correct?
Antef, or Intef, yeah. Well, not really. The Middle Kingdom starts in Mentuhotep II. Half of his reign was when he was just king of Thebes, and then in the second half of his reign he conquered the rest of the land and reunified it. And then there's a couple more of these pharaohs, and then you get to the beginning of the 12th dynasty with Amenemhat I. Now he's sort of establishes a dynasty. He's assassinated, actually, and his son Senusret I becomes the pharaoh. But so you have lots of kings called Amenemhat and lots of kings called Senusret in this era, until we get to the end of the dynasty where there are no male heirs, and Sobek Nefru, or Nefru Sobek, depends on which way you want to read the hieroglyphs, is the female or daughter of one of the kings, and she becomes the last pharaoh of the dynasty. And then we have the 13th dynasty starting, which is a much smaller affair. There's many, many kings. They only rule for a very short period of time each. Some of their names are Asiatic or Semitic, so it seems as though there's been a diminution at this point of the 12th dynasty into something that's much more broken up and unstable, as it were, and that causes a collapse in the 13th dynasty at the end of the 13th dynasty, which then brings in these foreign invaders, the Hyksos, who come in across the desert and occupy Egypt and really dominate the country for more than a century.
Now, I know that we're going, and I know everyone who's going to be freaking out right now because this is the first time we've ever actually done this on the show. We're actually going to be broadcasting all across North America as well as Pacifica on public broadcast radio in the coming week. So we're actually going to have to start doing like a mid-show break at some point, which will only be about 7 minutes for everyone who's out there, and that'll be in about 5. And I know for the last half of the segment, we're going to be talking about the Second Intermediate Period, as well as the fall of the Middle Kingdom, and going on from there. So everyone can stick around. It'll give you a chance to be able to grab a coffee, hit the water closet. But to be able to finish off this segment, between the New Kingdoms and the Middle Kingdom, how much of influence did the priest caste have in this time?
Not so much. The priestly caste are very influential towards the end of the New Kingdom. When the state breaks up at the end of the 20th dynasty, the priests then become very powerful, especially the ones at Karnak, the priests of Amun. In this period we're talking about now, which is the end of the Middle Kingdom, or the end of the 12th dynasty as the 13th dynasty comes into power, we then have a great influence from not the priesthood but the viziers, the controlling prime ministers, if you like, or chancellors of the land. They become far more dominant, far more powerful. And it's even been argued in the past that they were electing pharaohs. They were choosing pharaohs and plonking them on the throne. And if they didn't like them, they kick them out after 2 or 3 years. I mean, and there are so many pharaohs in this period. The 13th dynasty is something like 40 pharaohs or 50 pharaohs in this period. And none of them really have a very long reign. About 3 of them do. And so the power seems to be with the viziers, and this comes out of what happens at the end of the 12th dynasty, and it's also related to, in the new chronology, to the story of Joseph, because Joseph effectively became the vizier of the land of Egypt, and his sons Ephraim and Manasseh also were very powerful. After Joseph died, they were actually also controlling Egypt as a series of very, very powerful viziers. So the land seems to have been taken over by these immigrants who came into Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty, and they are effectively the Israelites sojourning in Egypt during the period before the slavery, when another Egyptian dynasty rises up, the sub-dynasty from Thebes comes along, a miniature dynasty within the 13th dynasty, captures the land entirely. They don't know Joseph. Joseph's now died, and they enslave the Israelites, or the Hebrews, in the land, and that's the slavery period before eventually the Exodus under Moses. So that's all happening in the late 12th dynasty and all the way through the 13th dynasty.
Now, after this period, I know that during the sojourn, we're referring to the 40 years in the desert, according to the Bible. Is that correct?
That's the period after the Exodus.
Okay.
You have a period about 215 years is the sojourn period, which is from the time when Joseph arrives in Egypt as a slave. He rises to the highest rank in the land under the Pharaoh. He brings his father Jacob in and the rest of his brothers, and that's the beginning of the sojourn, is when Jacob arrives, if you like, during the famine period, and they expand and multiply for a period of, 150 years or so, and then they're enslaved. After all these original patriarchs have died, all the clan eponymous ancestors of the 12 tribes have all died, and you have the descendants of those people. They're enslaved. Moses is born. He flees out of Egypt for a period of time. He comes back again, and then they all vacate Egypt, the land of Goshen, and they cross over through the desert for 40 years, as you say. That's a rough amount of time, and this 40-year thing occurs all the time through the Bible. They wander through the desert, and eventually they come and conquer the Promised Land and settle in Israel, what becomes Israel today.
And we're going to be going to break. I just want to be able to ask you one question, which you don't have to give the answer right now, but it'll be the hook for everyone to come back. If they spent 40 years in the desert, this was from the Facebook page, and it's a 6-day walk, what were they doing during those 40 years?
And you want me to answer that now or later?
We'll answer that after we come back.
I think we might have to. It's a long story.
Oh, I can't wait. Let's see here. What am I going to be giving you guys for music? We'll do that one. Sure. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will be back in about 5 to 7 minutes. Hang tight and stay frosty. And we'll talk to you in a bit. And ladies and gentlemen, we are back with none other than the world's most famous historian and one of the most controversial, David Rohl. So, David, before we went on break, I asked you about the 40 years when it's a 6-day trip, and you said it was a long story.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not a 6-day trip. I mean, yes, I suppose if you wanted to, I'd get on a bike and do it, but if you were walking, I doubt very much if you could travel the distance you put on your Facebook map in that time, because people have to rest, and you have. Don't forget also that the Israelites are coming out with their flocks and their animals and their old people and their young people, the babies, carts and everything else. They're not going to be traveling at a huge speed. And secondly, the terrain across Sinai is extremely difficult, especially the route you put on Facebook, directly across what we call the El Tik Plateau, which is very fissured and very broken up, and you're going directly against the fissures, so you're crossing all these dips and troughs and craggy bits, etc. There's virtually no water in that area either, so the way that the Israelites would have crossed Sinai was not to go directly across from the northwest to the southeast, but actually to go down to the south, because on that route you have water pretty much at every day's walk. Let's say an average of something like, when they're in a hurry, they could do maybe 22 miles a day maximum. When they were taking their time and there were no urgency involved, then they would probably be much slower than that. So the crucial thing is follow the water. You have to follow the water. And that's why people, even through the Middle Ages, were using the southern route down into the granite massif of around St. Catherine's Monastery, because down that way there is water supply all the way down and all the way up the other side. So although it's longer, it's much safer and much more reliable to go that way. And in fact, you have abundant water supply in the area of what we call Jebel Musa, the granite massif down where St. Catherine's is located in the south of the Sinai Peninsula. You have about 20 springs there and huge amounts of water all the year round. So there's no problem about going down there and spending a little bit of time there, which is what Moses did. They traveled down to the area of Mount Sinai in the southern peninsula. It took them about 3 months to do that, and then they stayed there for the best part of a year before they moved northwards again along the west side of the Aqaba Gulf and ended up in the Negev desert, which is to the south of Israel today. It's sort of the desert between the hill country of Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. And that's, of course, where they spent a considerable amount of time wandering around that area. But you said 40 years. Well, the thing is, it wasn't 40 years wandering, although that's what the Bible says. They spent a long time at one particular site, which the Bible calls Kadesh Barnea, or Kadesh simply. And that's the place where they probably stayed for much of that period, maybe as much as 37, 38 years they spent in that particular location. Why? Because they were going to become an invading army of a very, very powerful area. The Promised Land, if you remember, when the spies are sent up there to go and investigate and spy out the land, they come back with reports of these huge cities with massive walls and great defenses and these very strong rulers called the Anakim. The rulers were big, powerful men, and they were scared. And they knew they couldn't, they were a bunch of slaves. They knew they couldn't simply go and invade this place. They didn't have the training, the weaponry, they didn't have the size of the army needed to take over this area. So they spent many years in this place called Kadesh, basically training up to become an army, a military force, so they could then invade. And it was the next generation of people who actually did the invading under Joshua. Moses and Aaron, his brother, and Miriam, his sister, were all dead by then, and all the people who came out of Egypt were dead by then. So, it was a new generation that were militaristic, which then went across the Jordan to attack Jericho and invade the Promised Land.
And what this probably leads into the new series that you had spent some of last year working on. Yeah. What evidence has been found of this buildup and this militarization?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, because nomadic peoples tend not to leave evidence where they've been. I mean, if you go into any part of Saudi Arabia today or in the Sinai Peninsula and you look for the Bedouin, you can't find their overnight camps because they don't have pottery. In order to have pottery, you have to have cities with kilns and things like that manufacture the pottery. These were wanderers, so they didn't carry their water and their liquids around in pottery. It was too heavy, it was too friable, it breaks too easy. They had leather skins, goat skins and sheep skins to carry their water around. So you're not going to find the normal archaeological evidence for a people in the desert, because they didn't build houses there, they didn't have stratigraphy, they didn't have pottery. So if you find a bunch of bones in the desert, you're not going to know, who the people were that the remains are of. So it's very difficult to find a nomadic peoples in archaeology. It's very hard to do that. In the case of Kadesh, there's a different issue there, and it's quite interesting. And it's slightly complicated, and I hope you've got the sort of you have to think hard about this without the visuals, because it's quite difficult to get it together. But let me try to explain it to you. There's a Islamic tradition, also as well as a biblical one in this part of the world, where we have monuments dedicated to various patriarchs or heroes from the Bible. One particular one, which is very important, is the brother of Moses, called Aaron, who was the high priest, the first high priest of Israel. Now, his tomb is located on a mountain called Jebel Harun in Jordan, because he died in Jordan, and he was actually buried on top of this mountain. That tomb still exists today. In fact, one of the things we filmed when we were filming in Jordan is that we climbed that mountain, which is extremely difficult to get to and to climb up to, and we actually went into the tomb of the prophet Aaron, or Harun as the Arabs call him, and we actually found the tomb, and we went inside it and filmed it. Now, if that story is correct, and if this really is his tomb, and it would appear to be, the geographical evidence, the toponyms all seem to work very well if this is actually the tomb that he was buried in, the location. The Bible calls it Mount Hor, and the Arabs call it Jebel Harun, or Mountain of Harun, and Harun is Aaron. Then it all seems to fit very well. But what's fascinating about it is it looks down on this mountain, on the city of Petra in Jordan, which is very famous. Everybody knows Petra. But Petra is a Nabatean city from a much later period. It's basically from about the 3rd century BC through to the 1st century AD, around that era, much, much later than Moses and the Israelites. But it seems that the Israelites were in this same location way, way before the Nabateans. And so they used this as a sort of base. And it seems from the toponyms that this is the place that the Bible calls Kadesh. The word in Kadesh means holy. So it's a holy place that the Moses and the Israelites stayed. They built up their army, they made weapons, etc., in preparation for going to the Promised Land. Then Aaron died there. He was buried on top of this mountain. Moses then led the people northwards. He then died on Mount Nebo, and Joshua took over, crossed the Jordan River, and conquered Jericho. That's the story in the Bible. And it seems to all relate to this place called Kadesh, which we now know to be located at Petra. And in fact, all the great classical writers and church fathers all identified Petra as Kadesh in the Bible. So we're pretty strong on this. We think this is definitely evidence that we were looking for the location for the majority of the time that the Israelites spent in the wandering period at this location.
Now, you said that they had, after the wandering period, they did they go directly to Jericho to take that city over or destroy the city?
Well, the first thing they did was conquer the Jordanian side of the river. They conquered many cities in that area, so that was like a year and a half worth of conquest. Then they crossed the Jordan. Then they attacked Jericho, destroyed Jericho, burnt it to the ground. The walls collapsed, and we found the evidence for that in the archaeology there. The walls did collapse outwards. The city was then burnt. We found ash of about 1.5 meters thick on the thing of the burning, and then the city was abandoned for 600 years, which is exactly what the story of the Bible says about Joshua conquering Jericho. They then went up to the city of Ai in the hill country. That city has now been located at a particular place called Kibbutz Makatia, excavated by the ABR folk, the Associates for Biblical Research. They excavated that. It almost certainly is the city of Ai, which has been lost for centuries. And then they moved on up into the hill country. They conquered all the main cities in the hill country region, and finally ended up at a place called Shechem, where Joshua erected a standing stone, and he got the tribes to swear their loyalty to their God, Yahweh. And then they then dispersed to the different allotments that were given to them in the country for their territories, their tribal territories. And that basically is the end of the story of the conquest.
Now, Shechem, if I'm not mistaken, you had referred to the standing stone.
Yeah.
That standing stone is still there to this day, is it not?
It is, but it's not recognized as Joshua's standing stone. It's a huge white monolith that stands in front of the temple of Baal, Baal Berith. And it almost certainly is the original stone that Joshua erected there. The problem is, of course, without a revised chronology, it's far too early to be Joshua's standing stone. It's 300 years before Joshua's time, according to the conventional dating scheme. So most Israeli archaeologists and biblical archaeologists don't recognize it as the standing stone of Joseph. And that's the case for all this material we're talking about now. They simply don't recognize the big population of Semites in Egypt and the land of Goshen as the Israelites. They don't recognize the conquest of Jericho and the Promised Land as in the Middle Bronze Age as the work of the Israelites. They don't recognize the Joshua standing stone as the covenant stone, because it's all too early to be the time of the Israelites. That's the problem we've got.
Now, you also do have a lot of, for anybody who proposes a new theory, especially dealing with history and especially dealing with an area of the world as politically complex and culturally complex as the Middle East, the Levant, and northeastern Africa, there are some individuals who may push back and say, well, this can't be right because you had to create your entire chronology or an entirely new chronology to make the theory fit. How would you be able to respond to these types of criticisms?
Well, it's the opposite of that. I mean, when I was doing my degree and PhD at University College London, my work was focused on the Egyptian chronology, and I didn't have anything to do with the Bible stuff at all. I mean, I'm agnostic. I'm not a believer. I'm somebody who's inquiring into all this stuff, and as an historian, as an archaeologist. And so I was looking at Egyptian chronology specifically, and I was looking at the anomalies that we find in one of our intermediate periods, what we call the third intermediate period. That was my specialism. And I was seeing issues which questioned whether or not we, as historians, had constructed that chronology correctly. And I got the impression from the work I was doing that it could be shortened by, a couple of centuries. And as a result of that, when I then looked outside Egypt, through the window to Israel, through the window to Greece, through the window to Anatolia, the Hittite lands, etc., I started to see that things started to fit together much better with this shortened Egyptian chronology. So whereas in the conventional dating scheme, there was no synchronisms in the archaeology of Israel and Palestine with Egypt. Suddenly, with this shortening of Egyptian chronology, the bringing down of the dates before the third intermediate period, it started to lock together. We started to find evidence that matched the biblical dating and the stratigraphy with the Egyptian evidence. And so it wasn't a case of trying to prove the Bible and then looking at Egyptian chronology and trying to adjust it. It was the opposite way around. It was looking at Egyptian chronology, finding anomalies and problems with it, correcting the dating system in Egypt, then looking outside to the neighbors and saying, well, how does this now fit with the biblical story? And as I've been criticized so many times by people saying it's too good to be true, David, you can't possibly have got it right because it's too good to be true. And I say, well, why shouldn't it be good to be true if it's right? If the dating does seem to work and the synchronism do work, then it's going to be good, isn't it?
Well, it would be, and that's the whole idea there. You're able to at least back up the concept and back up the idea, which is the whole basis of turning any theory into, an actual, what would be termed in math, a proof. To be able to have that amount of not just one or two or three things. Well, they say one thing is a coincidence. Or is it two things is a coincidence, three things is a pattern? And if there's a pattern, it there gets to a certain point where it becomes harder and harder to be able to accept by the individuals whose life work may have been counter to what you're proposing. And obviously there may be individuals who want to protect that life work.
Well, I understand that, to be honest. I mean, if you have spent your entire life explaining away the anomalies, explaining why the evidence is not there, and you've written copious books about the subject, and you've taught it at university for donkey's years, well, of course you're going to resist this sort of thing, because it is a very revolutionary idea. I'm not surprised that I get resistance from it. It's a little bit like continental drift theory. I mean, that was not accepted by academia for about 25, 30 years after it was first proposed. But now everybody accepts the continents, drifted apart. and it's part of modern history and science. So, I don't expect this idea of mine, this theory, to be accepted overnight. That would be very naive of me to think that. But as I build up the evidence, as we find more and more evidence, we're convincing more and more people. And even the ones most resistant to the ideas of the new chronology originally are now sort of coming around to accepting begrudgingly certain aspects of it. And then they find other reasons why they can't accept it. But they do accept the evidence that's being presented as being convincing, and then they find an alternative view by looking at something like radiocarbon dating or something, where they will say, well, you can't do this because the radiocarbon dates confirm the conventional dating system. That's a whole different interview to deal with that. But we're finding new evidence all the time. And one thing that happened in the early 2000s, I went out and led 2 expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula in 2001 and 2004. And we were actually looking for evidence of the route that the Israelites would have taken through there, led by Moses, through the Sinai Desert in the wandering period. And we came across, I knew about it from my research before that, a new script that was found carved into the rocks in parts of Sinai. It's called Proto-Sinaitic. It's named after the Sinai, and it's actually symbols that look remarkably like Egyptian hieroglyphs, but when you try to read them, they don't read as Egyptian at all. They don't make any sense as Egyptian hieroglyphs. So somebody, some clever sod, had come along and invented signs that were clearly based on the Egyptian hieroglyphs and created a whole new script, which turned out to be alphabetic. It's the first alphabet in the world, invented by a Semite who translated effectively these symbols into the first letters of Hebrew words. So, for instance, the drawing for a house, the sign for a house, in Hebrew the word is beit or bet, so that becomes the letter B. The ox head is an aleph. If that's the word aleph for ox in Hebrew, that becomes our letter A today. And you could say the same thing for Mayim, which becomes our letter M. So all these signs of our alphabet derive from this first alphabet in Sinai. And some clever Semitic person created this modern alphabet, this first alphabet, which we still use today almost. I mean, the letters are almost identical. You can see our modern letters in this early script. And that became the language, the script of the Hebrews of the Bible later on. So it's very clear that this is actually, probably with the dating revision, is the earliest Hebrew writing in the world. It's found in Sinai, and when you translate it into Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, it actually references incidents in the story of Exodus. So it's real evidence of these stories and the events taking place in the Sinai Peninsula at this Middle Bronze Age period that I'm talking about.
I know that there was also mention in one of your lectures, and I think it'd be very important for at least everyone to have some context with regards to this alphabet, that the naming of the after the state of, or the kingdom of Israel was established by David, there was another point in time, I believe it was the Babylonians who had essentially invaded, or I think it's originally attributed to the Babylonians, but it actually may have been the Egyptians at one point had actually attacked Israel after the fact.
I don't quite understand the question. Try to explain it to me again. I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at.
Well, there's a mistranslation, which was done in one of the texts, either by somebody who wrote it down wrong, and it was then attributed to Ramses as the pharaoh who sacked.
I know what you're talking about now. You're talking about Shishak.
Yes.
Pharaoh Shishak. In the Bible, the very first pharaoh to be named, prior to this, all the pharaohs just called Pharaoh. But the very first one to be named is called Shishak in the Bible, and Champollion, who deciphered the hieroglyphs, went out to Egypt to try and find evidence of the biblical stories in the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he found an inscription at Karnak which mentioned a king called Shoshank, who was the founder of the 22nd dynasty. And he equated Shishak and Shoshank, so he made the biblical character Shishak and the Shoshank character from Egypt, 22nd dynasty, into one and the same person. And because this Shoshank actually campaigned in what we call today modern Israel-Palestine area. So there was a sort of connection there. But when you look into the details of the campaign, they're completely different. I mean, Shishak attacks and conquers the kingdom of Judah. This is in the period when the kingdom split into two, where you have northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And he actually invades the area of Judah in the south and conquers the cities there, and he takes the treasures out of Jerusalem, etc. So there was a sort of synchronism there that the Egyptologists leapt upon through Champollion, and it's never been broken. But the fact of the matter is that the two campaigns are completely different. Shoshank's campaign is in the northern kingdom of Israel. He doesn't actually touch the kingdom of Judah, so they contradict each other. And the two names, okay, they sound a little bit similar, Shishak, Shoshank, but it's not close enough. And what I found was that Ramesses, King Ramesses II, he had what we call a hypochoristicon. That's a lovely word. It basically means a shortened form of his name. So, for instance, you're a Chris. That's a hypochoristicon of Christopher. Okay, so and Beth is a hypochoristicon of Elizabeth. So Dan is a hypochoristicon of Daniel. So he's got a shortened form of his name. And his name originally is a bit of a mouthful in the ancient languages. We call him Ramesses II. Egyptologists refer to him as Uzamatre Seteperi Ramesses Meri Ammon. That's how he's normally referred to in his full titles. But when you hear it translated into the ears of the Hittites, when they wrote a peace treaty with Ramesses, they wrote it syllabically, so that we actually have the vocalization of the sound of the name. It's very, very different. It's Washmuaria Shatapneria Riamashesha Miyamana. That's how it sounds when you actually listen to the ancient language. So Riamashesha Miyamana, Riamashisha is the name Ramesses, and the hypochoristicon, or the short form, is just the last bit of that name, Shisha, Riamashisha. So he was called by the local people. He didn't have this big long name that they just referred to. They just called him Shisha. Now Shisha is very close to Shishak. And we can actually even explain the Kof. I won't go into detail now because the K at the end, because that's a complicated thing. But we can actually find the writing of Shisha if it would be written in Semitic, in Hebrew, would be very similar to Shishak of the Bible. And so it looks like Ramesses II, also called Shisha by the local people, was the pharaoh who attacked Judah and plundered the Temple of Solomon and took the treasures away, not Shoshank I. That makes a huge difference in the timeline, because Shoshank I was dated via the biblical chronology for the 5th year of King Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, and that's the date of 925 BC in the Bible. And so Shoshank was given a date of 925 BC for his reign, for the end of his reign, and all Egyptian chronology is based on that synchronism. But the synchronism is simply wrong. It's actually Ramesses II who plundered the Temple of Solomon, not Shoshank.
And for the Exodus, I'm going to try and transition here into Moses a little bit. Right. What is the date the date that's primarily given is at least mainstream accepted? I believe it's around 1750 BC, or is that
no? That's no different. No, in conventional dating, because they use this Ramesses connection of the city of Ramses as the city, the store city that the Israelites built as slaves, they date it to the time of Ramesses II, mid-reign, which is about 1250 BC. Now, the biblical date is actually 1447 BC, because they have a period of 480 years from the building of the Temple of Solomon the building of the Temple of Solomon in year 3 of that king's reign, 480 years back to the Exodus. So that brings us to 1447 BC. But that plonks us right in the middle of the 18th dynasty in the reign of Thutmose III, who was the most powerful military pharaoh in Egyptian history. He's called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. And there's no way in the world that the Exodus took place in his reign, because he was extremely powerful, and Egypt continued to be very powerful for at least a century afterwards. The same goes for Ramesses. Ramesses was a very powerful pharaoh. Why would you have an Exodus in either of those two kings' reigns where there's absolutely no sign of a collapse of Egyptian civilization at that time at all? There's no sign of a destruction of Egyptian army. So that doesn't make any sense at all, which is why, in a sense, when we look back to the 13th dynasty, which is where I put the Exodus, we do have a collapse of Egyptian civilization there for centuries. And that's when we have a period where we can put the Israelites in Egypt, because we have this massive population in the eastern delta of Semites at that time. And as I said to you, they disappear from this place, and they suddenly turn up conquering Jericho and the Promised Land 40 years later.
Now, Moses has been attributed to various historical figures within either Egypt or an amalgamation of various personalities. And even some people have claimed that he is more of a metaphor for, or as a parable. What have you been able to find as far as Moses the man? Was he a real person?
Well, archaeology is selective, isn't it? You're not going to find every single person in the Bible mentioned in text and stuff, because that's the nature of archaeology. Archaeology only really represents 10% of history, what we've excavated so far. It's another 90% we're going to learn from archaeology eventually over the decades and centuries as we keep digging. So we only have a small window of looking at this material. It just happens to be that we have a lot of material that seems to identify Joseph for us in Egypt. We seem to have found a lot of material for that. But for Moses, it's a little bit more difficult. We may have found him as a prince of Egypt. We certainly know the name of the pharaoh who raised him as a prince of Egypt. That's actually given in the writings of Artapanus. He tells us that the pharaoh raised Moses as a prince in the land was called Kenofres. Now, he's writing in Greek for his Greek masters, the Ptolemies in Egypt in the late period, dynasties, the Greco-Roman period. But he's writing this document for the Alexandrian Library, and he writes a history of the Jews. And in there, he mentions a king called Kenofres as the king who raised Moses as a child and a prince of Egypt. Now, that's Greek. If we translate that back into Egyptian, it becomes Kar-Neferre or Kar-Neferah. And Kar-Neferah was the throne name, the coronation name, if you like, of one particular pharaoh, and only one pharaoh in Egyptian history, who's Kar-Neferre-Sobekotep IV. There is no other king in Egyptian history with that name, Kar-Neferre. So we can identify the pharaoh who raised Moses as Sobekotep IV, who was a king, a major king of the 13th dynasty. That places exactly where we've got the Exodus in that period.
And was the second intermediate period, in your opinion, was that caused by the Exodus? I know.
Yep.
So there have been various theories, and one being posed by yourself, which actually seems to make a lot of sense, that during the Exodus period, when the Semitic peoples were leaving Egypt, that, and to be able to use a very colloquial term, they wrecked stuff like you wouldn't believe on their way out. What's been found, either archaeological or within the written record, that can attribute that Exodus to the beginning of that decline?
Well, there's a very famous papyrus called the Ipuwer Papyrus, or the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage is its formal title, which is written a little bit later but refers back to this particular period, and it talks about the collapse of Egyptian civilization. It talks about the river turning into blood. It talks about the darkness coming upon the land. It talks about the crops being destroyed, like the locusts or whatever it is in the 10 plagues. And it then refers to an extraordinary expression. It says the slaves are wearing the gold of their masters. Their slaves are wearing the clothes of their masters, which is like extraordinary. But that's exactly what this biblical story tells us, because after the 10th plague, the Egyptians give their slaves the gold and their clothes and say, get out of the country, we don't want you here anymore. You know, we're so fed up with these plagues killing all our people and our firstborn, etc. So this story, this Ipuwer Papyrus, seems to reflect exactly the story in the book of Exodus of the Israelite slaves and the 10 plagues, them leaving with the wealth of Egypt and going out to Sinai. It's all there in this Ipuwer Papyrus. So, and that is dated to the same period as all this archaeology I'm talking to you about, the end of the 13th dynasty. So it fits beautifully.
Now, moving on to Sinai.
Yeah.
There are some accounts. I know that there is I'm trying to find a chapel, somewhat of a cathedral that is there, where there is I'm going to say the bush that is claimed to be the burning bush. It's acacia, if I'm not mistaken, which is essentially overgrown the entire area. Are you talking about St. Catherine's Monastery? I believe I am actually talking about St. Catherine's Monastery.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, that being claimed to have been the burning bush, or at least a bush that had been around for a very long time, what evidence or findings have been found around Sinai that can attribute a very large amount of peoples being there?
Well, the burning bush is a bit of a red herring, isn't it? Because, I mean, we don't know what the burning bush means. You know, is it allegorical? Is it a real phenomenon of some sort? Something we can't explain through science. The fact that this bush is in St. Catherine's Monastery is basically just a tourist attraction that the monks have had since the medieval period. I mean, it's something to draw people there, to bring money to the monastery. So we can't really use that as evidence, so to speak. So I can't address that issue. But what we can address is the actual locale, the location there. Some people argue it's impossible for a large group of people to be camped at the foot of Jebel Musa in that area around St. Catherine's. Well, that's simply not true. The Air Raha plain, which is actually there near St. Catherine's Monastery, is massive, a huge plain, easily big enough to take a large encampment of people. So there's no issue about that. And I've already explained to you there's plenty of water in that region, so they wouldn't have lacked water. So there's good reasons to say that this is a good location for the story being set where the Israelites were for at least probably 9 months before they left again to go up towards the Promised Land. And then, of course, we have this writing of the so-called Ten Commandments. Well, in order for that to be done, there must be a script. And I've already explained to you that we have now evidence of a direct alphabetic script being written in Sinai, being carved on the rock surfaces there, which would have been the script that Moses used to write the Ten Commandments. So we actually have those letters, those alphabetic letters of early Hebrew, what we call Proto-Sinaitic, which would be very convincing evidence, especially when you translate them into Hebrew. You read those texts as Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and then you get amazing things happening. There's references to the golden calf, for instance. I mean, this strange story about when Moses is up the mountain getting the Ten Commandments, the people down below make this golden calf and they get into this debauched, drunken festival thing going on. And we now know what that golden calf was all about, because the goddess of Sinai was Hathor, who was a cow goddess, and she's referred to as the Golden One. And she's worshipped in Sinai at a temple there in a place called Serabbit el-Kadim. And she's referred to by the Semitic peoples who work the mines there, the turquoise mines and the copper mines, as Baalat. And Baalat means the lady. It translates into it's the sort of female form of Baal. And we have text actually written in this Proto-Sinaitic which says that the people who drifted towards or went to worship Baalat, the lady, i.e. Hathor, were killed. And that's exactly the story in the Bible, because the people who worship the golden calf, Moses ordered their killing. He told them to be killed. The Levites went and killed them all. So there's references to this golden calf in the text there. There's references to manna, this food that the Israelites used or ate in the Sinai desert. There's references in these Proto-Sinaitic texts to that as well. And there's references to them coming out of Egypt. There's references to the Pharaoh of the oppression. All these things are written in this alphabetic script in the rocks of Sinai. So it's very clear that they're connected to the biblical story of Exodus.
Now, what is your opinion on the plagues and catastrophes? And also, were there any, besides the final plague, and I actually think that you actually mentioned the water turning red as well.
Yeah.
What other documentation, whether in Proto-Sinaitic or in Egyptian, has been found to attribute to the plagues?
Okay, nothing in the Proto-Sinaitic other than the fact that it mentions the garden of oppression. Constantly in the Bible, Egypt is referred to as a garden because it's so rich and fertile. So it refers to the garden of the oppression and uprooting the people of the garden of the oppression, which is the removal of the Israelites out of Egypt into Sinai. But we don't have any mention of any of the plagues. But the plagues are a difficult one because the first group of them have been tried to be explained by many people through science, and it's possible to argue phenomena that we would call natural phenomena, explaining things like the locusts and the darkness and the boils and the flies and the frogs and the waters of the Nile turning red. All those things you can explain through natural phenomena, events in nature. What you can't explain is the death of the firstborn. That one is something that nobody can really explain, and I can't explain either. We do have evidence at the end of the 13th dynasty of plague pits in the ground at the city of Avaris where the Israelites were living, where people's bodies have just been tossed in on top of each other. that something terrible happened at that point, and immediately afterwards the Asiatic peoples, the Semitic peoples, left the city. So it sounds like the Exodus. Sounds like this could be the 10th plague, this evidence of these bodies in the ground. They don't have any grave goods with them. They're just tossed in on top of each other. But what it is and how it can be so selective as to pick out only the firstborn, that's something that science can't explain. And it's something that as a historian I can explain. I mean, I can't deal with theological issues like that. I can only deal with archaeology. I can only deal with historical documents. And when we're dealing with something that we could call supernatural, i.e. selective deaths of certain peoples in a community, then I can't handle that. There's no way I can actually explain that. And I'm not even going to try.
And for individuals who may look to other historical figures, I know that there is King Mesha of Moab, who has been attributed either in theme or in actual likeness to individuals such as Moses. How would you be able to explain to somebody that, no, this may not actually be, these are the differences you would need to be able to look for to say that this historical figure cannot be attributed to somebody like Moses?
Right. Well, first of all, you've got to not be naive. Just because a name sounds similar, Moshe, Mesha, doesn't mean they're the same person. So you have to forget that idea. You have to look at the history there. The Mesha stone that was found in Jordan mentions a king of Israel called Ahab. Okay, so we know that Mesha was contemporary with Ahab, and Ahab was a king who came long after Solomon. Nothing to do with Moses. Moses is much earlier than King Solomon, so they cannot be connected. Just because you've got a couple of consonants that look similar, a Mayim and a Shin, does not mean that they are the same individual, and you have to be very careful with that sort of thing. It's oversimplistic to compare names and suddenly make equations because names sound similar. So you can take an example, for instance, of the English word bow. You have many meanings of the word bow, and how it's written is different. You have the bow of a tree. You can bow down before a king. So you just because something sounds the same doesn't mean it means the same.
Now, for the life of Moses himself, there is also the memorial of Moses at Mount Nebo in Jordan.
Yeah.
Did you manage to visit that location?
Yeah, we filmed there. And although it's very commercialized now, there's not much you can actually identify with the story of Moses. But it's a very impressive place to stand and look out across the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea. And you can virtually view the entire Promised Land from there on a good day. So the story would be logical if Moses was to be buried somewhere and not permitted by God to cross over the Jordan into the Promised Land, then this is as good a place as any for that to happen. But there's nothing physically there that would prove that. I mean, what could you prove? A man stands on a mountain, he looks out across the Jordan, he dies and he's buried somewhere in that region. Well, you're not going to find the archaeology for that, are you? So we have difficulty with that sort of thing. Whereas with Aaron, we actually find his tomb. That's been known for centuries and centuries, and we have an Islamic shrine on top of it, so we know where that is. It's written about in the ancient writings. It's written about by the early church fathers. So we know about that. We can actually identify that. We can't find Aaron's body; that's long gone. But we can actually find the cave in which he perhaps was buried. One day, maybe somebody will find the cave of Moses' burial. That's a possibility. But as it is for now, nobody's actually probably looking for it.
Well, from his death and the passing of leading of the peoples to at least to the Promised Land, to his brother.
Not his brother, Joshua. Joshua was given command of the army after Moses died. Aaron died 3 years, was 3 years older than Moses, and he died the year before Moses.
Now, again, thank you very much for that correction. That's incorrectly remembering facts about a book I've read since I was a kid.
Sure. Right. Not to worry.
If you look at the historical figures, and leading on to, let's say, Daniel and his continuing on, and finally the rebuilding of, or at least the planning of the temple and the building of the temple by King Solomon, there is very little to be able to at least demonstrate that the first temple existed. I know within some mythologies, such as Freemasonry, it's either taken as historical fact with a very, very large mythology, but can still be seen as metaphorical. What have you been able to find during your journeys?
Well, Clearly, the Temple Mount is a very difficult area to do much work in. The Palestinian authorities do not allow any excavations on the Temple Mount. So you're never going to be able to dig that up and actually find the foundations, if you like, of the Solomonic Temple or even the Herodian Temple, King Herod's Temple, Second Temple. However, there are some interesting clues, and I think it's probably worth exploring those. The first thing is that the orientation of ancient temples, especially the temple in Jerusalem, was towards the east. In other words, if you were to imagine opening the doors of the temple, the sun would rise opposite and the light would shine into the temple. That's the orientation, always towards the east. Now, when you look at the Temple Mount construction, looking east is the Mount of Olives from the Temple Mount. Okay, and if you know the topography of the place, you'll know that the Golden Gate is in the eastern side of the Temple Mount, but it's not aligned with the Dome of the Rock. Now, the Dome of the Rock is the Muslim shrine, which is on top of the highest point of the mountain, and that is where most conventional scholars would place the building of the Temple of Solomon and the Temple of Herod. I don't do that. I say, no, that doesn't make sense at all. The eastern gate of the temple, which then becomes the Golden Gate, would have been orientated along the axis of the temple facing east. So what you have to do is you have to draw a line from sunrise on the Mount of Olives directly through the Golden Gate onto the Temple Mount. And if you draw a straight line through there, you come to a little cupola or dome with 8 columns on it, which is not more than about 1.5 meters wide, the diameter of it. And it covers an exposed area of the mountain, a flat block that's there, and the rest of it around there is all flagstones. But this one place where this dome is actually the surface of the mountain at that point, and it's actually flat. It's like a threshing floor. Now, the building of the temple was put on top of the threshing floor that was bought by King David from the local Jebusite. So it would have been a flat area. The area where the Dome of the Rock is, it's not flat at all. It's got a hilly, rocky thing inside it. So you couldn't build a temple there anyway. And this particular dome covers what we believe to be the foundation stone of the temple, and it's directly in line with the Golden Gate and sunrise on the Mount of Olives. And this cupola, this dome, is called the Dome of the Tablets. Now, what was in the temple was the ark containing the tablets of Moses. So this appears to be the very spot where the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the Holy of Holies of the temple, at the back of the temple, orientated eastwards towards the Golden Gate, or the original gate underneath the Golden Gate, towards the Mount of Olives. And that seems to be where the location of the temple was, not where the Golden Dome is today.
Wow. Oh, man, that is awesome. Wow.
What is significant for it, and I don't want to get too political here, but one of the great crises of Jerusalem is the wish on the part of Christians and Jews to rebuild the Temple of Solomon on the original foundations of that temple. But of course the Muslims, Islam, will not permit that because they think it's under the Golden Dome, which is in fact the shrine dedicated to where Muhammad rose to heaven on his white horse. Remember that story when he flew from Mecca? It's all part of the Quran's stories of. So that's the basis of that particular location. So if you build on this new site that I've explained to you, the Dome of the Tablet site, that's adjacent to the Dome of the Rock to the north. So you could build a Temple of Solomon there and not destroy the Islamic shrine or the mosque there. So you could actually build the 3 shrines, or have the 3 sides existing side by side, and not cause the total disruption between religions. You simply build a wall across between the Golden Dome and the new building of the 3rd Temple of Solomon on the other side to the north, and you could have the Jews and the Christians visiting the Temple of Solomon, and Islam and the Muslims visiting the mosques and the Golden Dome on the south side of the Temple Mount.
Well, oh, excuse me. Then you have to find an artificer, then you have to find a master craftsperson, and you have to find a king of Tyre, and that's going to be very difficult to be able to do at this point in time.
Yeah, we'll just go and get a Lebanese architect there, because that's where the king of Tyre lived.
I actually think I know a couple. So.
Yeah, but to be honest with you, no, I mean, politically speaking, it'll never happen, but theoretically it's possible to make Jerusalem into a city for all nations and all religions, and you can have your rebuild of Solomon's temple, and you will not have to destroy the Islamic shrines there, and everybody will be happy presumably under that circumstance.
Now, for the final segment, because we have about 15 minutes left, and I would get... I would get yelled at by some of my more... Well, not yelled at. Talked to very sternly with a smile and a wink if I didn't ask you this question. Because we do deal with a lot with alternative history and alternative ideas. Some are more out there than others. The Ark of the Covenant. What is your opinion on the Ark?
Where it's found, where it's going to be located, you mean?
Where it's going to be located, what exactly it was, what its origins were.
Okay, well, clearly it's a casket. We even have the names of the people who made it in the Bible. So we have the two craftsmen who made it. There was a tabernacle around it, which was a tented shrine, as it were, which was mobile, which moved around with the ark. It supposedly contained the two tablets of the law that Moses wrote, and we don't know what else was in there. Okay, so we have that in the story, the biblical story. Looking beyond that, we have this strange business about people dying if they touch it. And that I can't explain. I mean, I know no way to explain that. As a historian, I don't deal with the supernatural, and I don't deal with the sci-fi aspects of it either, because I'm not into that stuff myself personally. What happened to it? Well, we really do know what happened to it if you accept that what we call the extra biblical books that are not included in your conventional King James Bible, which are the Maccabees books, 1 and 2 Maccabees. The Apocrypha. And so in 2 Maccabees, we're dealing now with the time when Nebuchadnezzar is marching down towards Jerusalem from the north, from Babylon, and he's about to seize the city and destroy it and absolutely smash the temple to smithereens. And this is the destruction of Solomon's temple. This is the time of the prophet Jeremiah. And in 2 Maccabees, it actually tells us what happens to the ark. He says that in fear that it will be destroyed or taken away to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, he and his people remove the ark from the temple, and they cross the Jordan, and they go to the place where Moses is buried in his cave near Mount Nebo, and they place the ark in the cave where Moses was buried, because after all, Moses was the author of the tablets, and the ark was the container for the tablets. So that's where it has remained, according to Maccabees, ever since, in the cave or the burial place of Moses. And it says in the Bible, nobody knows where it is now. It's long forgotten as to where it is. Well, it then threatens us all by saying the day that somebody finds it will be the beginning of end times, that will begin the story of Armageddon when those tablets are found. So that's what's in Maccabees. Whether you believe it or not, that's entirely up to you, but that's the evidence we have, and it's the only evidence we have for what happened to the ark.
And I know that there is also myth, if I'm not mistaken. One of them is King Solomon King Solomon having visited the Queen, or the Queen of Sheba visited him. Apparently they produced a son, and that son came to visit his father and then took the tablets away from him. There is also a tale of it actually being in Ethiopia currently, and having been used during World War II to repel the Italian forces. There's a lot of mythology regarding this, and the Maccabee story is actually one that I have not actually heard before.
Well, you want to read 2 Maccabees, and you'll see that passage there. Yeah, well, the whole story about the Queen of Sheba and everything, and the Ethiopian story of the Ark is interesting, no doubt about it. Of course, Graham Hancock, his first book was about that particular Ark. In the Talmudic text and elsewhere, they mentioned several copies of the Ark, that there were more than one copy of the Ark, and it may well be that one was either taken away by the Queen of Sheba back to Sheba, the land of Sheba, and they had a son together, as you say, and it's possible that's the one that's in the Ethiopian what do you call it now, chapel, if you like, in Ethiopia today. It's possibly a copy of the original, not necessarily the original one. And so there are various explanations to how it got there, and what the reasons behind it all are, and whether there was an original ark only or there was more than one ark. The copies were made for various purposes, so it's hard to say whether or not that story is authentic, and nobody's ever been able to go in and see that box in that chapel, because the guardian who looks after it is the only one able to see it. Graham's never seen it. I don't know anybody that I know of that's seen it. So although it may well be there, it's hard to have a historical trace back to Jerusalem from that particular location in Ethiopia, other than the tradition that we have.
With let's say your work with Tim Mahoney, I know that the production of the new series it's still going on, or has it wrapped up?
Yeah. Well, it's huge. It's absolutely, it's bigger than the Bible. It's actually the plans are at the moment for a 12-part series. Okay, each program being 2 hours long, so that's 24 hours of material that has to be edited and put together. Now, normally the ratio between filming and final product is something like 1:15 or 1:20. So you imagine how much material has to be filmed in order to fill those 24 hours. Now, whether or not we end up with 24 hours or something different is difficult to say. The process is still, going on. They are currently editing the first of those episodes, those 2-hour episodes, which is about this proto-Sinaitic script I told you about, the alphabet and the evidence for that. And then they're moving on to the location of the Mount of Moses, the mountain of God, and what direction the Israelites went on to. And that will include this business about the crossing of the Gulf of Aqaba and all that sort of thing, and my arguments against it. And they'll go on to do various other topics within that project. Finally, we'll probably move on to the United Monarchy period. There's a huge amount of evidence now coming up about Saul, David, and Solomon, and we're finding lots of material for the Judges period as well now, which all comes into this program, this series. Whether or not they'll all be in the 12-part series or be another series to go afterwards is difficult to say at this stage. So there should be one program coming out within the next few months, and then the others should follow fairly rapidly because most of the filming has been done for that early storyline. So you might see by the end of the year 2 or 3 programs finished by then. But of course, I'm a contributor to it rather than being the presenter. Tim is the presenter of the program. I'm the director. So it's mostly about his version of the story, and he takes whatever material I give him and he assesses it in relationship to other people's arguments. So we are not going to be agreeing like we were in the first Patterns of Evidence program about the Exodus, because now I wholeheartedly disagree with the crossing of the Gulf of Aqaba. I don't believe that to be correct at all. I also disagree that the Mountain of Moses was in Arabia. I don't think that's correct either. I think it was in the Sinai Peninsula. So we're going to disagree about it, and it's all down to what the viewer will say or will understand of the arguments and which one they're going to accept as being correct. I think I'm correct. Other people may think that these other theories are correct, and we'll see. But I think the argument is very strong now that the traditional location and route into the Sinai Peninsula is the one that actually is the authoritative one, the one that is based on the real history.
Now, you have to look at it, for anybody who's looking at a theory, you have to take a look at all the evidence and to take it where it leads. So even if you do have disagreements, that could still lead to possibly a third reality, which could be either a mix of the two theories or one or the other, and that's okay, because it's about at least thinking about the possibilities.
I think that's true to a degree, but we have a dichotomy here between the conventional route and location of the Mountain of God and this alternative theory of Saudi Arabia being the place where the mountain is located, which necessitates a crossing of the Gulf of Aqaba. They can't both be right, and you can't have a bit of one and a bit of the other. That doesn't make any sense, because the real location of the crossing of the Red Sea, we now think, and many Egyptologists are on board with this now, is not located in the Gulf of Aqaba, but is actually located in northwest Sinai, in the area what we call the Suez Canal region today. It's much more likely to be there, and we have some very, very strong, not only archaeological evidence for that, but we also have scientific evidence to produce a parting of the sea there, or the waters there, across the northern Sinai with a strong eastern wind of 62 miles per hour. There's been computer modeling done of that region, this area we call Parchuf or Yam Suf. The Egyptians call it Parchuf, the Israelites call it Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And we can actually have scientific evidence now of computer modeling as to what happens to water when you blow an east wind across it. It actually parts the water for several hours, something like 8 hours, and it returns in a rush. And that's exactly as described in the Bible. And it's in this location alone that we get this phenomenon happening. Wow. This phenomenon happening.
That is awesome. Oh man, I can't
so
wait for that.
we can show it scientifically now, and that will all be in the programs as well. Work's been done by Carl Drews in America, who's got this modeling with the terrain, the depth of the water, the power of the wind. You can vary all these different elements to come up with a model which shows how the waters can part. You can walk through on dry land at 62 miles per hour. You can walk in 62 miles per hour to part the Gulf of Aqaba down 2,500 feet. You would not be able to stand on the planet if the wind was blowing that strong to part that sort of water.
Now, I'm going to ask you, at least with you and Tim having worked together for, the first Patterns of Evidence, that came out 2015. I'm probably guessing it was about a 2-year production time.
No, it was 13 years.
Wow, okay.
Where he started it 13 years before that. And he first interviewed me, I think, in 2001 or something. So a long, long time ago. But then he was looking at the route of the Exodus. And then after interviewing me, they decided they wanted to change the story and to deal with the actual historicity of the Exodus first. Because if you don't have a real history of the Exodus, then how can you have a route of Exodus? You need to start with one and follow with the next.
And what is your creative process like with regards to either the filmmaking or trying to form the bulk of how each episode's going to work?
Well, I don't have a say in the construction of the films, the documentaries, because that has to be done by the director and his team. I mustn't influence that because that would be a bias. That can't happen. All I can do is to communicate with Tim, and we have so many hours and hours of conversations. I go and stay at his house and we talk for weeks on end, or we go into the studio, we film interviews, and we have hours and hours of interviews. He comes over to Spain and he sits here and we talk about stuff here. We meet in Israel, we meet in Jordan. We're always talking, going through ideas at locations and just musing over the whole story and getting all the evidence together. So he uses me as a sort of a library of information. And then he goes away and constructs his documentary. And although people think I somehow or other have an influence upon how it comes out, I don't. I don't have a say on how it comes out. That's down to Tim, not down to me.
Now, you're a musician as well.
Yep.
You're a relatively accomplished one, actually, since... I'm trying not to date you here. I'm going to say at least like the late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, 70s, my boy. Yep. Absolutely.
Tim's also a musician. He plays guitar as well. How often do you guys, jam? What's your music creative process like?
Well, I'm a bit different really because I started my career at the age of 16 in the music industry with the first band that I formed, and I was a keyboard player. And within a space of a few years, I was a recording engineer. I became a recording engineer. From there, I became a record producer. So my side of things were more on the technical and creative side in the studio, not in the live performance side, although we did perform live in the first few bands that I was in. And so I'm much more of an arranger and director of music, or what we call record producer, than a musician now. I don't jam in bands anymore like I used to do. So today I still write film music, for instance, and record film music. I have a studio in my house here where I record music, and quite a lot of the music in the Patterns of Evidence documentaries is my music that I've composed for them and recorded. So I do a lot of symphonic music. I use Pro Tools recording systems to a bit like Hans Zimmer, that type of music, if you know it from like Gladiator or one of those movies. So that's the type of music I do today, and it's not really the sort of music you would do to jam. Tim is more of because he's a devout Christian, he tends to do a lot of Christian songs, modern Christian songs, and more traditional ones. He also is very heavily involved in blues and bluegrass and stuff, so he plays a lot of that kind of thing. I would call country music, but the nice country music as opposed to the other sort. And so we don't really play much together like that, but we do talk music a lot. And of course, because he's a musician, he can appreciate it when he wants me to write music for one of the documentaries. He can understand the process. He can also appreciate the music and how it will fit into the visuals. So that relationship works very well as well. But so we have an older brother, younger brother relationship, I suppose. I'm older than him, and he is learning from me the historical and archaeological elements to construct his documentaries. I'm learning from him the processes involved in making this type of documentary. So it's a two-way street, if you like, and it's a very good relationship, a very, very warm relationship.
And and speaking of warm, actually, I'll point this out. You recently were on a cruise conference lecture series. And I know that this is very popular, that very learned men such as yourselves will escape to the Adriatic to my home country, Croatia, to enjoy the food, enjoy the sights, and talk about very large ideas. how did your last lecture series go, and when is the next one?
It was good fun. I mean, we flew into Dubai, which is in the Persian Gulf, and joined the ship there. And the ship was on a round-the-world trip. It had been on the seas for 99 days. I mean, they'd gone right around the world. And the people on board had been having guest lecturers from all over the place, arriving at different locations and talking for a week or 2 weeks, and then disembarking and waving them off for the next leg of the journey. Well, I was asked to do the leg from Nuweiba all the way around the Arabian Sea, through the Arabian Peninsula, into the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, going into the Red Sea, all the way up the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way to the city of Aqaba. Then we went off to Petra and Wadi Rum in that area, and we came back down to the bottom of Sinai. We went all the way up the Suez Gulf. We went through the Suez Canal. We looked at the Sea of Reeds area and all the rest of it, and then we sailed across the Mediterranean to Sicily. We came through the Messina Straits and ended up in Naples, which is where I disembarked. Then I spent 3 days researching in Rome, because I'm researching material for the Holy Grail legends as well, which originate, you're probably not aware of this, but they originate in Rome originally. The Romano-Spanish traditions are the original core of the Arthurian tradition of the Holy Grail. And so I've been doing a lot of work on that recently. So I spent 3 days there going into these amazing, very early basilicas, 3rd and 4th century basilicas, looking at the mosaics, looking at the people, the personalities that were involved in the building of those constructions, those early Christian monuments. And so the whole thing was not just research for me, but also giving these lectures on the ship. I gave 9 lectures altogether. Large audiences, fantastic theatre, sailing around the seas, lovely food. What more could you want, really, for an archaeologist historian like me in his retirement years to be going and doing stuff like this? So I've got another one. I'm doing another one in the Med just before Christmas in December, and they keep coming in, and I'll continue to do them. I'm getting awfully fat on the food, which is not very good, but but at the end of the day, my job is to disseminate ideas and inspire people, and I hope I do that, through talking to you and programs like this, or going and lecturing on cruises, or giving public lectures in the States. That's my job now. The archaeological side is over for me now. My knees can't take any more of that. Digging in the dirt and getting filthy dirty and hurting your knees when you're in the hard ground. I leave others to do that now, but I'm still involved in the interpretation of the evidence. So that's my job now. I'll probably continue to do it until I'm boxed and put in the ground. But, that's the life I lead now. My days of traveling and adventuring are over, apart from these cruises, which is a nice way to do it.
And finally, for the lecture series, the DVD lecture series, again, the 2 DVD lecture series contains what content specifically?
Well, there are 4 lectures in there of about an hour each. There's also some open discussion between the audience and myself, which is a small audience, very homely, sort of like little setup we've got there. Very nice. I can't remember what's on there now, but it's mainly to do with the Exodus. I think there's a lecture on Shishak and Shoshank, this equation, and why it's mistaken, and the fact that Ramesses II is the real Shishak. There's one on the wandering through Sinai and the locations. There's one on the Exodus story itself, and the story of the Sojourn and Joseph and all that. So all that material is in there. There's one on the Alamana letters and where that works in the chronology of Egypt now with this new chronology. So they're all in there. And it's available from the Patents Evidence website. It's as you said, it's not expensive, and it's very good value for money, I think. And it's a way to learn about my arguments and my thesis without actually having to delve into too much heavy reading.
And also, I know that there was a question in the YouTube chat regarding David's book regarding the Exodus. The link is also in the show notes, Exodus Myth or History. It's available on Amazon. Is it available on Kindle or EPUB yet?
It's not on Kindle, no, because it's full color. It's like 400 pages of full color on proper artwork. So to try and put that into Kindle is very difficult. It is available as an ebook. So you can get it from the Apple store. It's available there because they can handle it. But a Kindle is not so easy to do full coloring on. It will also be an enormous download. So I've not done it on Kindle. I may eventually get it on Kindle, but at the moment it's only available as an ebook. And
finally, you are working on a new book, if I'm not mistaken. I've heard rumblings of that.
Yes. What is it now? Let's have a think. It's called Legendary Kings. So I'm continuing the story after the conquest of the Promised Land, after the Exodus. I'm moving on into the period of Judges. and then onto the United Monarchy, which is the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, and then to the Divided Monarchy, and I'm dealing with all the archaeology and how that fits together with this Egyptian timeline and the New Chronology timeline to show you that it's not just about the Exodus story, but the entire history of the Bible works within this new dating system and is compatible with Egyptian history.
And how far along is that? Can we expect that to drop soon?
Well, I've been trying to get it finished for quite some time now, but I keep getting distracted by people doing these interviews with me and also going off on cruises and things. So I've got to get back to it now. I'm going to spend much of the next few months now getting back to work on that. And so I'm hoping to get the writing finished by the end of the year, and it should be out sometime next year with a bit of luck.
You had the art for that, or at least the options for the art for that, on your Facebook page quite a couple of months ago. So if anybody is following David on Facebook, if you go back into the history far enough, you can actually find it. I think it's breathtaking. I can't wait for it, but I have to, so I will. And just like all of you, but again, good things come to those who wait. And David, I'd like to thank you. We're at the end of the interview. I know that you have an evening to get to and a weekend to enjoy and to be able to kick back and relax. I want to thank you very much for the time this morning, well, this evening or this afternoon for you, this morning for me. A fantastic, fantastic interview. Again, one of, at least in my opinion, probably it's going to be one of my favorite shows of all time here. Again, thank you for the 2 hours.
Well, thank you, Chris, as well. I mean, it's great fun. It's always good to talk to you, and we'll do it again sometime.
Oh, definitely. I'd love that. All right. And one moment here while I just cue up the music. I don't have anything topical, David, so I'm going to play this is actually from my friend Abe Van Dam, Shake It. It seems to be our kind of outro theme. For anybody who's wondering what we're doing next week, we talked about Egypt and the 3000 to 1000 BC era. Next week, we go so far into the past, it's actually the beginning of time. We have one of the top scientists behind the mysteries of the Big Bang and what happened afterwards, with this new released book. No, actually, it's being released on the 24th, so a couple of days from now. Brian Keating is going to be on the program. We are his world-exclusive first interview here in the Den of Lore. The book's been reviewed in, if I'm not mistaken, Nature as well as Astronomy magazines, and man, that's going to be awesome. Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain, and 5 p.m. Pacific. It's going to be here live on YouTube, Periscope, Facebook Live, and Twitch TV, and also on audio on Spreaker. My name is Chris George Zuger, and this has been The Den of Lore with David Rohl, episode 88, April 20th, 2018. Have yourselves a wonderful weekend, ladies and gents, and we're out.